Hello and welcome. We're so glad that you've joined us today. This is the first of a three-part webinar series called Social and Emotional Learning in Education. No, Social Emotional Learning in Teacher Education. This episode is called Where Are We Now? I'm Maria LeRose.
And I'm Kim Shonert-Reichl.
And who are you, Kim?
Oh, I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also the first author of this important report titled Teachers First, a national scan of teacher preparation and social and emotional learning.
And we're going to be talking a lot about that report today. And you wanted to acknowledge that there are other people who are the co-authors of this report.
Yes, two of my students, one is a present doctoral student, Jennifer Kittle, and the second one is Jennifer Hansen-Peterson, who did her master's degree with me. And there's a number of other people who were involved in this report in the coding, and you'll learn more about that. But Maria LeRose was actually one of the authors as well.
I was one of Kim's students when I was I was one of the more mature students, actually. And you know what, I think before we get started, we should acknowledge who are sponsors or the funders of this particular report and who actually supports this broadcast today. So that's CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, are the sponsors, funders of this report. And we're here at the University of British Columbia coming to you live from their studios. So that's why we have our two mugs.
Yes.
So Kim, and I should tell you that over the next hour, we are going to share some of the findings from this report, not all of them today. It's going to be spread out over the three webinars. We are also going to be joining a very special guest, and that is Roger Weissberg, who's waiting in the wings. And he is, among other things, the Chief Knowledge Officer for CASEL. That's Kim's mug, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And we're also going to be taking your questions. So I think we're going to maybe put a slide up now. You see that URL at the top of the screen. When you see the screen, this is where the way you will be sending in your questions. Let's just take a look at that. And you can actually send your questions at any point. We'll put them in the queue, and we'll get to them when we get to the Q&A session. But there it is, GOO.gl/slides/NMC6S5. And we'll come back to that number for you. But if you want to write it down now and send your questions as you think of them, that would be great. So as I said, we're going to be getting to the report during this hour. But before we do that, we thought it would be good to start with a little bit of background and some definitions. And so, Kim, let's start by maybe just talking about that term, social and emotional learning. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, social and emotional learning really refers to those skills and competencies that students or individuals have to manage their emotions, to form positive relationships with others, to show caring and concern for others, and make responsible decisions. And really, I feel somewhat awkward saying that, given the definition, because I've actually often referred to CASEL's definition, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and Roger Weissberg, who is the Chief Knowledge Officer of CASEL, would be talking more about that. But what's really important to think about is that these skills, these social and emotional skills, they're essential. Really, it's centuries ago that Aristotle stated, educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And so this notion of social and emotional learning, or social emotional competence, is important for education, is not so new. But what is really new is the science, really showing how important these skills are for success both in school and in life.
And you've been doing some research yourself in that science and contributing to that science, and we'll talk about that as we move through. But in general, what has research shown then about the importance of the qualities that you just talked about and that we just saw on the screen in terms of children's lives and in terms of their well-being, their learning?
Yeah, so social and emotional learning, or these competencies, are seen as important for so many domains. For example, these skills help prevent mental health problems or bullying that we know now, with increasing concerns about anxiety and depression, bullying across schools, that if you have these skills of managing conflicts, of being able to have empathy and concern for others, that you can actually prevent a lot of these problems that we see unfolding that have been around. But we also know that social and emotional skills are important for for life success. We know that there's research now showing that, longitudinal research showing that children who have these skills early on actually are more successful in adulthood. And even that these skills, some people think that, paying attention to social and emotional learning actually helps you, might take away time from academic achievement. There's research showing that actually it helps bolster your academic achievement.
The good news is that children can, quote unquote, learn these skills that as you say, they are malleable. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think there's still a common belief out there that these kinds of skills are traits, that you're born with them, that they either have empathy or you don't. But we know now from the research that they're malleable, especially through the recent science of neuroplasticity. We know that you can teach these skills. You can have them early on, and you could train them. And there's lots of evidence now in terms of looking at social and emotional learning programs, evidence-based ones that really show that you can promote these skills.
Okay, well, as you said just a few minutes ago, really, one of the people in the world who's been involved in social and emotional learning longer than anyone is waiting in the wings. And we're going to invite Roger Weissberg to join us now. So welcome, Roger.
And Maria.
Hi there. I'm going to do a brief introduction, but I must say, Roger, it's hard to do it brief when I looked at your CV. So I'm going to do it as brief as I can. I've just said earlier that Roger is the Chief Knowledge Officer at CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Roger is also with the University of Illinois at Chicago, Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Education, and the NoVo Foundation Endowed Chair in Social and Emotional Learning. And as we said a few minutes ago, that CASEL is actually the sponsor, the funder, the initiator of this particular study that we're talking about now, our research. So Roger, welcome again.
It's nice to be here, and I want to start with an expression of appreciation to both of you and your collaborators. You've produced a wonderfully important report, and it is great that it's not just sitting on a shelf, but coming into webinar land. And I think the impact of this report could be great, so we have to work to get the word out. So thank you for all you've done to date, and even more for all you will do going forward.
Yeah. I wonder, Roger, if you could start by just those people who don't know what CASEL is, just give us a sense of CASEL, because I think the history of CASEL really is the history of social and emotional learning.
Well, you've already said a couple of times that CASEL stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And we've been around for 23 years. And with certain insights that have been developed over that time that Kim, I think, laid out really powerfully. There is a very strong scientific base that social and emotional skills relate to positive outcomes and performance in school and in work and in life. There is a strong base, literally hundreds of studies that say that you can teach these skills, and there are broad benefits for students when they learn them. And then one of the key questions that we've dealt with over time is, okay, so if the skills are important and they can be taught, how do you prepare people? How do you prepare educators? How do you prepare people in out of school time? How do you prepare families, parents to promote and enhance these skills? So CASEL, I would emphasize today, although we always talk about the integration of academic, social, and emotional, the middle words, but we're a collaborative. We work with the best researchers, the best educators, the best policymakers, the best child advocates, with the goal of making SEL an essential part of education. So this collaboration, for example, Kim is the best, and one of the best, and has done incredible work over the years. And when it came to our deciding that, hey, this is an important focus, colleges of education, first of all, we knew about the work that had been done at UBC over the years for teacher preparation, but also, and the broad network that Kim had established. So we felt she would be the best person to really reach out to do this work. And I would just say that CASEL has a goal right now. It's an aspiration to have evidence-based social and emotional learning, preschool through high school, in 50% of the schools in the United States by 2025. And we began many years ago with CASEL, where we looked at classroom-based programs for the most part. And then while we could see that these skills could be taught in the classroom, the field has expanded over time to become more systemic. So now we spent a decade at least working school-wide with programming. So everything from what it means when you're coming to school in the beginning of the day, to how you're greeted, to what goes on with curriculum and instruction in the classroom, to school-wide programming, to connections to schools and family and community organizations. What are the partnerships in a community? So we've thought more broadly about that. We've gone from programs to school-wide programming. In the last 6 years, we've worked with districts on how to scale up this work across districts. This is something known as the Collaborating Districts Initiative. One of the things that we're most recently involved with is a Collaborating States Initiative. So we want to think actively about how we go to the state house, to the schoolhouse, to the classroom in terms of supporting this work. And most recently, we're looking at assessment issues and how to measure social and emotional competencies as well as possible. So I would say CASEL as an organization is a collaborative to advance the science, the evidence-based practice and policy of social and emotional learning. CASEL has always tried to trailblaze and identify the key issues, maybe that nobody else really would have the capacity to take on, or the determination and the stick-to-itiveness to stick with. A lot of these projects are multi-year projects that we take on. And but again, we're not a center who does all the work at CASEL. We're a field builder who collaborates with people around the world, the best people, to help advance this work.
Thanks, Roger. I'm going to ask you and Kim, actually, if in those years that CASEL's been doing that work, if you've observed an evolution in terms of people's understanding of the importance of the social and emotional development of children, and importantly, how we can promote those qualities. Have you seen an uptake? Have you seen a change? And how has that evolution looked?
Well, I began this work 40 years ago. And discovering a question that I've been committed to over that time. The basic question is, how do schools and families and communities work together to promote positive outcomes in students? And a lot of this work has been school-based. And I would say probably in the 40 years, there are fluctuations where there's more interest and then a little bit less interest. But I would say right now, there is the most interest that there has ever been in this work. We kind of are amazed. There was a recent survey with all these terms that might be used in education to promote kids' intrapersonal and interpersonal competencies. What's the most common term that's really used across the nation? And it's social and emotional learning, or social, emotional, and academic learning. We, at this point, are challenged as an organization, CASEL, to think through how do we respond to the incredible demand at this point from educators in the field. It's really one of the reasons why we think about preparation in colleges of education. But I would say at this point, and there's a lot we could point to, the requests from schools, from districts, from states that we have to work with. And I think everybody says this is important to do. And part of the challenge is, but we want to do it in the best possible ways. We want to do it in evidence-based ways. We want to support implementation of programming with high quality so kids benefit as much as possible. And that's the challenge we face now. So it is really, really popular right now.
And I was just going to add to that, starting off in my own background, I didn't mention is I started off as a teacher who actually went through a teacher preparation program at Illinois State University. So even though I'm in Vancouver now, I'm actually from the States and was both trained as a teacher and taught in the Chicago area for a few years, and was so interested in this area. And then when I became a professor and was doing research, the beginning of my career, not as long, but about 25 years, I was knocking on people's doors saying, please listen to the importance of social emotional learning, or, at that time it was just the social emotional dimensions of teaching.
And in Canada as well.
In Canada. And sometimes people would open the door, not as much. Now, as Roger said, it's a challenge because the uptake, and it's not just in the US and Canada, it's around the world. There are entire countries that are taking on social and emotional learning. The OECD, or the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, now who does the PISA test, now have added the social and emotional skills for social progress. There's initiatives happening in countries. They just had a meeting in China about Education 2030, where they're seeing the importance of including social and emotional skills within education. So this is an explosion of interest, of science around this notion. And I think in some ways it's to do with people looking at the world and seeing what problems we have today, what are the skills we need our workforce to have in the next decades coming. But it is the challenge, and we need, I think of all the viewers here who are part of that idea of becoming the ambassadors around social and emotional
Well, we're
learning.
very excited. I'm just going to take
Maria
a second
and
to
Kim,
talk.
if I could just add one thing really quickly.
Yeah.
CASEL introduced the term social and emotional learning to the field and defined it in a publication called Promoting Social and Emotional Learning, Guidelines for Educators 20 years ago. And there were 9 co-authors there, and we felt like we knew everybody who had interest in this work in the field. Last year, we produced a handbook on social and emotional learning research and practice, and there were 95 contributors to the handbook, and there were 37 chapters that were written. And I just wrote a foreword to a book, Social and Emotional Learning in Australia and the Asia Pacific, which is a remarkable book where there were another 50 or 60 contributors there. So Kim's comment, which I really think is important, on multiple levels, interest is growing. One big level is with quality research being done, and a lot of that quality research really is worldwide, where some of this work may have begun in North America, but clearly it's being continued, improved in important ways worldwide, and then we learn and improve the work we're doing based on the work that others are involved with.
Right. What I was wanting to say is that just as a reflection of how global this movement is going, with us today are people from all over the United States, all over Canada, but also Japan, India, England, Brazil, and there are probably more. And we'd love to hear from you through Twitter or whatever way you want to get in touch with us with your questions later, because we'd love to know what's happening around the world. But that's pretty exciting. And that brings us then to it's one thing to have research. It's one thing to understand about the social and emotional well-being of children. It's another thing to actually promote it in the places where children reside. So Roger, just tell us again, why did CASEL think that this was the time to be putting resources and attention to the teacher's preparation?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. One of the things I would point to is a report from Civic Enterprises and Peter Hart Associates in 2013. It was a representative sampling of teachers across the United States, and they overwhelmingly said SEL is important. It can benefit rich kids and poor kids. It's important for all the things that I was talking about earlier. It helps them do better academically. It helps them do better in terms of citizenship. It improves the climate of our schools. It prepares them for college and the workplace. So there is a positive view, and teachers say, and we think we can be incredibly important in advancing and teaching the competencies to kids so that they can navigate life and the world better. But they said, we need support. And part of that support comes from our principals, part comes from boards of education and from superintendents and central offices that we need support for. And we need good professional learning. We need good communities of practice as we implement this work. And if you think about this, I think a lot of the strength in the field to date has really been focused on in-service training for teachers. And then the key question that always comes up is, well, it's good that you're doing some work with teachers who are already in the field and you've learned a lot from doing that, but how do you prepare all teachers to do this work? And if you think about the issues of scale and how really to broadly disseminate this work, and how to reach teachers at a critical time. The key time is when they're being prepared. And I would say probably there needs to be a continuum of work in this area, but it starts with what's the preparation like, and then what are the first couple of years of teaching like, and then how does it go over time. But we really have to think, and a lot of the states we work with, and I know Kim's going to be talking about some of that today, but a lot of the states we work with and a lot of the districts we work with have really pointed out to us in terms of the work being done, especially a lot of our districts in our collaborating district initiative, how we get teachers who are prepared from our communities, who are coming into the schools, and how we socialize them is an important part of this work. So, and people would say, so how widespread is it in colleges of education anyhow? That was a question we heard over and over, and at a certain point we said, oh, Kim will find out.
Indeed, she does. Roger, that's a great setup for the next portion of this broadcast, which is to start to look at that, at what Kim found and Kim's collaborators found. So will you stick around, because at about 10:45 we're going to start taking questions, and we hope that you'll be with us, Roger, to help us answer those questions.
I will.
Good.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You can relax now. Kim, so let's get started by looking at this report. Again, the name of the report.
Teachers First, a national scan of teacher preparation and social and emotional learning.
Okay. Just a brief overview of the report. What's it about? Picking up on what Roger just said.
Yeah, so I just want to say a couple of things. One thing is the report is going to be released. You're just getting kind of the taste of it right now, some of the key findings, particularly for the first phase. But this report was released right before the second webinar. The report really focuses on really reviewing the literature on what we know so far about teacher preparation and social and emotional learning, and the research that we did. And we really had two phases to the research. Phase one, we decided, I'll just say phase one focused on teacher certification requirements, and phase two looked at SEL within teacher preparation programs in colleges of education in the US, in the United States. We decided, instead of start right with the teacher preparation programs, it actually was a suggestion of both Roger and others at CASEL who said, let's see what the state policy guidelines say. What are the requirements to be a teacher? So every U.S. state has a Department of Education in which they outline the criteria of what you need to do, what skills you need to have in order to get certified as a teacher in that state.
And each state is different.
And each state is completely different. Yes, there were some differences. So we really started with that phase one, which I'll be talking about today and giving some highlights of that, of looking at what is the degree to which dimensions of social and emotional learning are incorporated into teacher certification standards.
So to be a teacher, you have to have these qualities.
Exactly.
And the universities will teach you those.
Well, that's the question.
That's the question
of how much it trickles down to colleges of education.
That's right.
And
but that's a good
the next
explanation
webinar.
Of the overview. And when you looked at social and emotional learning, you actually broke that into three separate areas. And maybe let's first look at those areas and then explain to us why you did that.
Right. So we decided, a lot of people, when they think of social and emotional learning, they think right away of teachers teaching these skills to students.
Yes.
So they go right away to students' own social and emotional learning. So our three dimensions included the teacher's social and emotional learning, as you see now up on the screen, the the social emotional learning of teachers, the learning context, and the social emotional learning of students. So in our code, when we developed a coding guide for looking at these documents in each state Department of Education, we coded along these 3 separate dimensions.
Okay. And so let's just for a moment stay with the part of that three-legged stool, let's say, or whatever analogy you want to use, the part that is the SEL of teachers. So before we go to what you found about requirements, what do we know about, in general, about the social and the emotional well-being of teachers these days?
Well, it's interesting because this is now just getting recent attention, the focus on the SEL of teachers. But we know a lot of things. We know that teaching is a very stressful job. A recent Gallup poll of looking at occupational stress actually found that teachers and tied with nurses, 46% said that they experience stress on a daily basis. Just a little bit above doctors, which was 45%. So we know teaching can be very stressful, that teachers experience a lot of stress. We also know that about reports vary, but about 40 to 40% of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years of teaching.
Within the first 5 years?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, many report that it's because of the stress, being unprepared to dealing with the classroom behaviors, with the mental health problems of students, of not being adequately prepared. In fact, one recent report that looked at 50% of teachers who left the profession said 35% of them said they left because of being unable to deal with the daily stress of dealing with students' problem behaviors.
That's tragic, because you think of when a person decides to be a teacher, it's because they have a passion for being with children, helping children. So within 5 years that they dipped their toes in and they've stepped out again.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to really think about is that teachers' own social emotional competence, how important that is. A recent study that we conducted here at the University of British Columbia with my co-author, Dr. Ava Oberle, we looked at stress contagion in the classroom, and this notion that teachers who began teaching, had reported higher levels of stress and burnout, actually had students in their classrooms with higher levels of cortisol. And let me just tell you a little. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Elevated levels indicated heightened stress. So we talked about this stress contagion in the classroom, this notion of teachers with higher levels of stress and burnout, students with higher levels of cortisol. Now, we don't know which direction it was. It could be the teachers are coming with stress and burnout and the students are catching that. It could be that students are coming into the classroom with higher levels of stress, and the teachers, because of their empathy and care for their students, they're catching it, or some combination of the two.
Yeah, I just think about my own experience as a student. If I had a teacher who was, thinking back, who was stressed, how that affected my learning even, because I was so concerned with the teacher's reaction to me that I wasn't paying attention to what I was being taught, which is why I don't know where all of the states are, all of the states are on a map.
Well, and it's just interesting, that notion of teachers' well-being. I think we've all experienced times like that where a teacher, how important that teacher-student relationship is, and teachers even, and how that influences our learning and sets the learning context, which is another dimension, but also the notion of how much we feel connected to that teacher. So I think the other thing I do want to mention, another report talked about that the cost of teachers leaving the profession prematurely costs the U.S. $7 billion a year in terms of teacher turnover, retraining the teachers. So again, this idea of really focusing on teachers' own social emotional well-being and competence is so essential. And you can imagine there's research now showing that when teachers don't have the social emotional competencies, they don't deliver these evidence-based social and emotional learning programs to the best extent.
But we do know that teachers understand, I know there's research that teachers understand the importance of the social and the emotional well-being of students, right?
Yes.
There's an appreciation of that. And there is a positive note here about when teachers do receive training. I mean, what do we know about that?
Well, there is one study. Again, the research is very sparse in this whole area of teacher preparation and social and emotional learning.
Amazing.
I just have to say, but there is research saying that when teachers felt that in their teacher preparation programs that they received training around classroom management, students' mental health, they felt more effective and better prepared to deal with those thing. So we know there's research saying that when teachers reflecting back saying, when I had that information in teacher prep, I was better equipped.
So that makes us even more hungry to know what you found when you did we did the scan.
Yes.
So let's just now go back to that three-legged stool and talk about what you mean by learning context. What were you looking for? What does that mean?
Well, the learning context really, again, is another, is kind of the foundation. Well, it's not kind of, it is the foundation for social and emotional learning. When you have a classroom context that's caring, that takes into account students' needs, that has positive teacher-student relationships, that actually has connections to family and parents are part of that, recognizing the larger community context, the school-wide, as Roger was mentioning, how important that is. That's really the foundation. I often mention it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for social emotional learning to really take place.
So you're saying that in the teacher training that they're not only that awareness isn't only raised about that, but maybe they're even taught and practice strategies to think about the context as well as what they're doing specifically with students, right? All right, so we kind of get a sense of the kinds of things you were looking for in this scan. So let's get to the report now. And maybe just first of all, what do we know about teacher preparation in the U.S.? Where are they trained? What do we know?
Well, we know, we're focusing on the teacher certification standards. So there's about 200,000 teachers who are prepared in colleges of education and other types of even alternative methods of teacher preparation across the U.S. A year, 200,000 a year. And in each of the states in which they are certified, can get certification, each state has documents that have been outlined about what you need to have the teacher certification requirements. So in order to do the study, we first we have our 3 dimensions of social emotional learning of teachers, social emotional learning of students, and the learning context. And we created a coding guide using CASEL's 5 dimensions for the SEL of teachers and SEL of students. So those 5 dimensions, again, are social relationships, relationship skills, self-awareness, self-management, as well as responsible decision-making. And so we use that for our coding of SEL of students and SEL of context.
So there are 2 phases of this research. The first phase is the one you're going to talk about today. Just know that in future broadcasts, we're going to talk about the other phases. The phase 1 is specifically looking at the state requirements.
Yes,
okay.
So the certification requirements. Okay. And I was just going to just double click a bit on the learning context. So the 4 dimensions of the learning context that we examined included the classroom context, the supporting school-wide coordination, developing school-family partnerships, and building school community partnerships. And I'm not going to go in detail about our coding guide, but just to say we were meticulous and looking at what kind of language we were looking for in terms of what constituted social and emotional learning within that, and then through a very rigorous process, downloaded hundreds of pages for each state certification. And just so you know, there's differences in terms of what they require for a secondary school or high school teacher, elementary school, some that were just specific to, if you're going to be a secondary school teacher. So we really focused a lot on what was required overall across all of those in terms of the teacher certification requirements.
So because I was in the room when all this was over, and then that happened, this is a big deal. This is a lot of documents from each state that the researchers had to comb through. And when you say coding, try to find those words that indicate that there's something in there that's pointing to one of those aspects of social and emotional learning. Then what?
Yeah. So, and I will say that it wasn't all, they were not clearly laid out saying this is CASEL's dimension of self-awareness. We had to look for the language that communicated issues of self-awareness. So even developing the coding guide, through science, really informed by the latest science, so even things bringing in other terms that are used around social emotional learning, maybe positive youth development or mental health and all those kinds of terms.
So that's a big job. So they coded, and then what?
They coded, and then once we found through that, again, looking at those 3 dimensions of SEL of teachers, SEL of students, and the learning context, what would happen is that when we found statements in the State Department's teacher certification requirements, they'd get like a point. Did they have self-awareness listed somewhere in the teacher certification?
So score it in a way.
They were scored.
Okay,
So if
okay.
if they either had mentioned that or not mentioned. So we were pretty open, so they didn't have to have a whole bunch of material saying self-awareness. They didn't have to have, 50% of the documents, just if they had something in there that said the teacher needed, or the student needed, or the teacher needed to teach the student this, or the learning context.
So I feel like now we need a drum roll. Too bad we don't have a drummer in the room, because now we're
Yes.
going to start to look at some of the findings. And if we begin maybe with the SEL competencies in teachers, the first slide.
Yeah, so teacher social emotional learning. So here we're reporting the findings per state. So these are, if you look at the legend over there, you'll see the very dark states are the ones that had at least 4 of the 5 dimensions of SEL, of those 5 dimensions listed by CASEL, that were existing in their teacher certification requirements. The lighter, the somewhat not as dark blue, meant that they had at least 2 or 3 of the 5 dimensions, and then so on. The key finding here is that almost all states had some dimension of social emotional learning of teachers. Remember, teachers own social emotional learning within their teacher certification requirements. It is interesting to mention that not one state had all 5 dimensions, that we did not find one state that had all 5 dimensions. However, maybe you could put that up, the map up again, Julie, because I'm going to be talking about it specifically here. Is I want to mention some of the states. So for example, as you see, California, as well as Hawaii, and South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Missouri, you'll see that they had at least 4 of the 5 dimensions of SEL. So they really showed that there were some states, as well as a whole bunch of states along that Atlantic, like Rhode Island and Connecticut, as well as New Jersey and Maryland, had more, and then the other states to a lesser degree. What was interesting when we started sort of digging down in terms of, well, which of the 5 dimensions did they have in their teacher certification? The most common ones for teachers were the teacher's own responsible decision making was one of the 5 core areas they addressed, as well as the social awareness and relationship skills. And much to a lesser extent, they had self-awareness and self-management for teachers in those dimensions that were listed. So, it's kind of interesting that responsible decision making, for example, was there. And if we looked at what sort of like one example from, this is from the Nebraska, actually, Department of Education, had something like the teachers needed to have the ability to recognize and deal with dehumanizing biases, including but not limited to sexism, racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Around social awareness, they talk about teachers must be aware of their own awareness of children's mental health areas as well. And around relationship skills, Alabama State Board of Education talked about the ability to develop a positive relationship with every student.
All right, so you said that's what was most commonly included. What was most commonly absent?
Well, most commonly absent were what I was mentioning, self-awareness and self-management.
Okay.
So very few states had anything about teachers developing their own self-awareness of their emotions and their strengths, as well as how they manage those emotions.
And yet there's research that says that teachers' own self-awareness does impact the way they are, and so the way they affect students' learning. So that's interesting. Let's move to the second one, the second finding. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. And
I
the
think I'm
second
gonna put the
findings are
state
around
up there.
how teachers
map.
promote students' social and emotional
Right.
learning.
So this was a focus, and here you see much more variability in terms of what the states have in their certification requirements about students' own teachers having the capability to promote their students' own social and emotional learning. And I'll say, of course, there's some dark states over there. California is coming out there, Nevada, as well as Florida, Louisiana, I think, and some
Illinois.
I have to give a shout out to CASEL, and several along the, including Maine and New Hampshire, Massachusetts. I know there might be some people from Massachusetts. Again, these are the states in their certification requirements that have a focus on teachers promoting students' SEL. And as you see there's also some lighter states that have very little. Again, just telling you our legend over there, that you see that they have, if they have most or 4 or 5, they are darker color and all going to light. The ones that are very light colored have only like one dimension of social and emotional learning within their state.
So what's your analysis of that? When you look at that, what are the big pictures that you see?
Well, I think that, again, you see that there's not a coherence in some ways. It's very interesting just across the United States in terms of certification requirements, that there's great variability, especially around some states really like Illinois, which has social and emotional learning standards. And actually the CASEL has a whole focus. Actually, Linda Dusenberry has been doing some great work around standards for social and emotional learning at the state level. So we know certain states do have specific SEL standards and others do not. Again, when we dug down deeper to look at what are the dimensions of social and emotional learning of students that teachers are emphasized in terms of the dimensions of the requirements, and what you find is that that the skills that students SEL, the ones that are given the most emphasis are students, again, responsible decision making, relationship skills, and self-management this time for the students. What's absent, relatively absent across all the 5 dimensions, is self-awareness of students and social awareness. Now, I think those are concerning to me, just given what we know early on from the science, from the research about how important self-awareness is, knowing your strengths and weaknesses. But that self-management we know is important. But that social awareness, which is showing care and concern for others, being empathic, and how important that is.
And self-awareness is movement towards self-assessment. Students assessing their own learning, and without self-awareness, that's difficult to do.
Right, and let me just give in a couple of examples around this self-awareness. So here's one from the Missouri Standard for Teacher Education around self-awareness. In the documents, it says, uses assessment strategies, that the teacher uses assessment strategies to involve learners in self-assessment activities to help them become aware of their learning behaviors, strengths, needs, and progress. Around the area of self-management, it says the teacher, this is from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it says the teacher uses an understanding and of individual and group motivation. And around relationship skills, and I'll use this from Illinois, the Illinois State Board of Education says the teachers must understand how to help students work cooperatively and productively in groups.
So let's just put up the number again that people can, or the email address, I should say, or the URL, if you have any questions, because we're going to get to questions in just a minute. We have one more finding that Kim's going to walk us through, and then we're going to go to you. So as Kim is starting us into thinking about the 3rd set of findings, which are the learning context, this is your chance to go to the goo.gl/slides URL across the top and send in your questions. So Kim, the next and the final findings that we're going to release today have to do with the learning context.
Yes, so I think I'll wait for Julie to put up that slide of the learning context, and just again show the tremendous variability of the learning context. This focus on things like the classroom context, family school partnerships and stuff. And again, you see there are some states, although the majority of states are addressing this of almost all of 4 dimensions of that learning context, which I talked about, the classroom context and stuff. And in a number of states, however, there are some states that have virtually nothing, or they have something, they're very light colored. And from the thing, it just basically says that they are having, they have it maybe mentioned, but not across the board. So it might be like just for high school teachers or middle school teachers.
I'm actually surprised that this one has so many dark states. So the idea of the learning context, of course, in the classroom, but your 4 dimensions are outside of the classroom, the community and the connection. That's encouraging to see.
Yes,
that it's at least a requirement.
I think to me, one of the concerns, I would say, however, is the what we know about the classroom context and how important that is. And as Roger was saying, and he entered the field 4 decades ago with this idea of how important the community in the school is. And so the idea is how important that is. The learning context is the foundation. And it's not just the context of the classroom, it's the context of the school and the community, and especially those, well, not just especially, but really critical are the parent relationships with that school.
Right. So I'm going to take your questions now, and but before we do, just to say that the real question that's dangling here is, how do those state requirements trickle down to actual teacher training, colleges and universities? In our next webinar, we're going to be going into those findings, but that is the big question, right?
Well, of course, the idea of here we have state certification requirements, which I say is somewhat a positive picture. It's not all of the states and there's variability, but the idea that, I didn't even mention this, we weren't even sure we'd find anything. So, the idea that we found the majority in each case of states having something about SEL of teachers, SEL of students in the learning context. Now, the question remains, how does that trickle down to colleges of education? Is there actual coursework in colleges of education that help that align with these requirements?
Right, and that's going to be the cliffhanger for the next episode. So you have to come to the next episode, obviously, which is on February the 14th, Valentine's Day.
Yes.
So one of the questions that came to us before we arrived today is really about the report, looking at the report and saying that only 18% of states included self-awareness. It's picking up on that thing that you've talked about today, where self-awareness and social awareness, but in particular in this case, self-awareness, is not included as much as you would have thought it was. And this person says that her observation is that very few career training paths actually do include that aspect of ourselves. Then she talks about in 2015, an 8-week SMART, which stands for Stress Management and Resiliency Techniques program, was a required course for first-year nursing students at the University of British Columbia in the Okanagan, and then asked the question, should programs that address intrapersonal dimensions of self be required programs?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because I think, number one, there is science, again, evidence really showing that these types of programs, both for, they said nursing in that case, but we've done, my colleague Rob Roser and others have done some research around that SMART education with teachers and found really positive benefits for teachers. Tish Jennings, who will be joining us for another webinar, will be sharing some of her research on the Care for Teachers program. So this notion of that you can, again, they're malleable. Now, should we include them in teacher preparation? Yes. The whole idea of developing your self-awareness and how you manage your emotions, how you manage your stress should be, again, foundational. And it's interesting. One of the interesting questions here is often when you go into teacher preparations, because you want to help the kids, yes, you don't realize that you need to help yourself. And I think of that metaphor, I know others have used that, if everyone's been on a plane, that you put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then you put on the child's. And I think we need to think more about that by helping yourself and learning these skills, you are actually helping children.
I've heard it, teachers say, just to be given permission to look after themselves is big. Roger, we're going to bring you back in now to help us look at these questions as well. Do you want to add anything to what Kim said? I see there are other questions coming in. We're trying to find Roger. Just a sec. It's us, Roger. We're not hearing you yet. Give us a sec.
Yeah.
And there you are.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi. Nice to be back. In terms of the last question that was raised, should these programs be required in colleges of education? I would step back a little bit. First of all, Kim's presentation was very powerful, and it is interesting. We often say that SEL is not really a new concept. Kim started by saying it since the time of Aristotle. Before Aristotle, this kind of thing has been emphasized. I think that CASEL's just tried to provide some structure and ways to think about the work and in kind of more systematic ways. So our first goal is, I think a lot of people in colleges of education would say, well, sure, the teachers should be more self-aware. We all should be more self-aware, but oh, how do I do that? Okay, what are the steps taken? So while I would not say, well, these programs should be required in colleges of education, I think part of our task is to make all professors in colleges of education aware that they exist and aware of the benefits and aware of the strategies. And by doing that, at least as a starting point, then people know that there are resources that they can rely on to do some of this work maybe more effectively.
Okay, good. Thank you. Let's go to another question now, Julie. Oh, I just saw it up there.
Oh.
Talk among yourselves while we're waiting for the question to come up.
I don't know. Maybe you
Oh,
can
dear.
read it? Okay,
There we go. Is there an equivalent to, say, Bloom's cognitive hierarchy, but for affect, obviously, that you are using?
For in the scan? I wonder if it's a reference to the scan. So I'm aware of.
Yes, I think that's.
Yeah, I think so I'm aware of Bloom's taxonomy. We didn't, certainly there's probably components of it that would align, but we really stayed in our coding, really stayed true to the CASEL, the idea of, what self-awareness, social awareness, those aspects. And maybe you're referring to I'm not quite clear if it was referring to the learning context or, I'm not sure, but we did, of course, drew from lots of different theories. Social and emotional learning doesn't have just one theory. It draws from a number of different theories. And so, I'm not entirely clear if that's the answer to the question.
Well, and I would just add one thing quickly. Even when we developed the Illinois standards, if you look at the learning progressions that are there from preschool through high school, you'll see a lot of Bloom's frameworks incorporated into that work in terms of more sophisticated understandings of what affect or cognition even that is being brought to social and emotional competence for different age levels of kids.
Yeah, and I just was thinking one of the things that we want to do after this webinar is we have a website and we want to put some links to things that we've mentioned here. And I think one thing we'd like to do is maybe put a link into the Illinois SEL standards so people can go and look at those.
All right.
By the way, if I can say something really just quick that I think is cool, Oakland, which is one of our collaborating districts, was the first district in the country to suddenly say, oh, we should have preschool to adult SEL standard.
Wow.
So part of the messaging of this report that says, well, what are we doing for the kids? What are we doing for the teachers? And what's important about the context? There are some districts now who are recognizing this is broader than just the kids. It's about all the adults in our learning community.
Wow.
So they kind of have broken some ground there. And I just wanted people to be aware of that exciting development.
Important message. Another question. Would love for you to also discuss why and how SEL can be connected and aligned with culturally responsive teaching approaches. Thanks in advance. That was a smiley face on there. It's very social and emotional.
Certainly, I will say in our entire scan, our coding guide, we did, that was definitely terms that were used to incorporate SEL, knowledge of diverse learners, understanding diversity, culturally responsive teaching. Those were terms definitely we coded as being part of social emotional learning, social awareness and things. Roger, I don't know if you want to say something more about that.
I would say in the districts where we're working with, which are enormously diverse, that many of the districts have developed competencies and standards, and probably the area where there is the highest interest of integration is with culturally responsive teaching at this point. So there's been a lot that has been developed. There's some writing coming out on the project, and I would say one of the interesting developments in CASEL's work is we're starting within all of our districts. There are sometimes equity departments and SEL departments. We're bringing them together in doing this work, and also there's a scholar, Rob Jagers from the University of Michigan. Rob and I have formed a group on SEL equity, diversity, and social justice to kind of think about some of this work being integrated more effectively too. So there's a lot underway in these areas that I think is going to be helpful.
Thank you. We have about 3 minutes left, and I'm really thrilled to see how many questions we have. We didn't know how many we would have, so next time we'll allow more time for this, but let's do one more question. Oh, this is a good question. Will this study transfer into looking at Canadian schools and teachers and teacher training?
Yeah, I think people, I'm thinking that there's a lot of people here in British Columbia and in Canada watching this webinar because we're here at UBC, and we'll be talking about what's happening at UBC, as Roger kind of alluded to in the beginning. There's a lot happening around social and emotional learning in our teacher preparation program. One of the things we started off, we were going to look at Canada. It was really hard to look at the standards across, but I will just mention what we know now in terms of British Columbia, that BC in the August, when new curricular competencies and redesign of the K-12 curriculum came through, that now includes social and emotional learning as part of integrated within the K-12 curriculum. So I think as that is unfolding, we will have more of the teacher preparation programs, at least in BC, including social and emotional learning.
Julie, just scan down.
I'm not from Canada, I will say this is a groundbreaking study, and you might mention when it's actually going to be released, because I think the frameworks that have been developed and even the way you're thinking about this is going to influence countries worldwide. So it's a very important contribution that is, I think, going to lead to more work in countries throughout the world.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. As I said, we don't have enough time to get to all the questions, but there is one that's up there that we won't get to today, but it's a question that will tease our next broadcast, which is, what can school districts do? What can school districts do to make sure that the teachers that are coming in have this kind of training? So we will pick that up next time. Roger, we know that you have a meeting to go to in 1 minute, and you're chairing it. So can we suggest gently that it's probably time for you to go?
I tried to use my problem-solving skills. I delayed it for a few minutes so I can. But, thanks. It's been a great conversation. And again, I'm so appreciative and excited about the report and the work, and the fact that you're spreading the word in this way is just wonderful. So thank you.
Well, thank you very
and
much.
Have a happy Friday. Have a wonderful weekend, Roger.
You too.
And in this last minute that we've had, we'll just tell you that we will hope that you will join us on February 14th for our second webinar, and in that webinar we will also have some guests that'll be looking at phase 2, the key findings, and the guests will be a couple of deans of education, Gary Sasso from Lehigh University and Mark Ginsberg from George Mason University, really to talk about how does that requirement, for example, trickle down? What happens at the deans of education level? We'll also have 2 people who are running exemplar teacher training courses that do integrate social and emotional learning. One is Deborah Donahue-Keegan, and she's from Tufts University. We're very excited to have her on, as well as John Tyler, let's call him Ty Binfet, who's at the UBC Okanagan. And for your interest, he includes animals and dogs a lot in his research as well. So you'll want to check out this website. You see the URL at the bottom, the ECPS URL. That's where you can go at any point to see this webcast again. I know that you'll want to share this with all of your friends, so be sure to share that. This webcast will be available at any time. Also, when the report is released, you will be able to find it there at that website, and find out about more webinars. Kim, do you want to say any final words before we go?
Well, I just want to remind people that the entire report will be released before the webinar in February, so you'll be able to see an executive summary along with all the maps we showed today and much more details. And for those who are really interested in sort of the details of our coding, I'm happy to share coding guides. And again, I just want to thank Roger Weissberg and thank my team here, including Maria and Julie, who is behind the scenes, and Jenny as well,
and Toby
as well. Yes.
And just to thank you for being here and for caring and for being a part of this conversation. We intend to continue this conversation with you. And if you subscribe to today's webcast, you're automatically subscribed to the next 2. So Julie will be sending you invitations to come on Valentine's Day. And I hope we see you then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend. Bye.